Good morning. Today I'm here with a double hat. I'm a professor in the geography department here at Concordia University, and I teach environmental impact assessment. So this is one hat, and the other one is I'm the chair of the Commission on Art and Cartography of the International Cartographic Association. And this is the second hat. And what I'm going to present today is some kind of a connection between these two functions. First, I will give you a little bit of contextualization of environmental injustice, because what I'm going to talk about is environmental injustice in Montreal and different ways of approaching it. The first way is with my first hat. So basically, it was a pedagogical project in a course called Environmental Geographic Information System for Environmental Impact Assessment. And in this course, master students were supposed to address a question: is there any environmental injustice in Montreal? So in order to do that, they had to gather all kinds of data and try to do some kind of analysis in order to get some answer to that question. The first hat is, while they were developing this database, we used this database to organize a workshop that took place in September 2010 here, where what we did is we provided the database related to environmental injustice in Montreal, and we launched a call for papers, and people from all over the world were supposed to respond to this call by responding to the database, either from a cartographic perspective, a geographic perspective, humanities perspective, or an artist perspective. And this, the entire work is been released in a book that's been released like a couple of weeks ago, that combine and compile all the results of this process. So I'll first talk about the collecting the data as a pedagogical process, and then using the database as a process to bring together artists and cartographers. A little bit of contextualization about environmental injustice. It was first explored in the state in the 1980s. And basically people were starting to see some relationship between income, race, and health issue. So it was starting to be more and more obvious. This has been growing through the 1990s and recently as well. So environmental injustice can be defined here with Monte, the disproportionate exposure of communities of color and the poor to pollution and its concomitant effects on health and environment. To make it more positive, environmental justice has been defined as well, and is the other side of the story, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, quote, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to development, implementation, enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So really the idea was to try to explore what was going on in Canada, in Montreal. So in Canada, the situation is slightly different than in the US. The level of segregation, social, racial, is lower, so the situation is different. Research have shown some correlation, mainly with proximity to major transportation corridors. Access to housing is cheaper, and access to dioxide carbonate or any kind of air release is higher. Also, the higher risk of exposure of Aboriginal population has also been emphasized in different studies. In Montreal, in comparison to Canada, there's slightly higher level of income disparity. But deprivation and ethnicity are not directly related to health issues. So there are many studies that have been done. Some show some specific neighborhoods, but overall, there is no general trends that can be emphasized here. So there's no obvious patterns of environmental injustice. Well, we wanted to go a bit further than that, and we wanted to see how we can better understand the situation in Montreal through this class. So basically, students arrive in the class and they assume that, well, you know, all the data are available, and we all collect data. There's so many data all over the world and the internet. You can go and grab whatever you want. Well, the reality is that it's much more complex than that. If you want the data that you really need for a specific area that you're interested in at the scale that you really want for the time period that you're interested in, the situation is quite complex. And this is pretty much synthesized here by this quote from Dennis Wood: "The cost of collecting and organizing data about the environment is insane." So basically, only governments can really afford to provide those data. So therefore, we, as NGO, individuals, academics, have to rely on those data because producing our own data is way too expensive. So the data collection. 18 students from this master class in Geographic Formation System for Environmental Impact Assessment were divided in 5 groups. One group was supposed to collect data for socio-demographic data, one on health, one on air quality, one on industry, soil toxicity, and noise. And they were around and spent a lot of time trying to find all kinds of data, and we had some discrepancies. So socio-demographic data are fine. We have all kinds of data produced by StatScan, and they're accurate, they're comprehensive, there are always issues, but overall, those are pretty good data. So here we see minorities, visible minorities in Montreal with some clusters, and median income. So greener it is, higher is the income. Red, lower is the income in Montreal. So it's pretty easy to have some sociodemography, see some sociodemographic structure. When it's time to get health data, it's a bit more complex. Also, we know those data exist. For instance, asthma cases are recorded. They're usually not available for privacy reasons, so it's not necessarily easy to have access to those databases. So the databases that are accessible are the databases at the CLC level, so the Health Administration structure. So there are 29 on the island of Montreal, so it's a really coarse scale in order to compile data. So students were able to get some data, develop some indicators, and try to find some relationship. But already we are at a very different scale. In terms of air quality, data is complex and not necessarily available. So there are 19 stations that record air quality on the island of Montreal, but only a dozen of those stations provide data that are available. So it's not enough to have a good idea. There are some release from industry that we can use, and that's what they did here. They used the release from industry. So we see oil refineries up there that have a lot of impact. But this is really interpolating some data. There is a study that has been done at McGill to collect data about air quality on, I think, about 129 points, which is much more accurate, but they didn't want to give us their data, so we had to re-interpolate their own data. So basically, privacy reason and accessibility to the data were an issue here. Soil toxicity is also an interesting element that we can take into account when we study environmental injustice, but there are a lot of places where it's sampled, but it's extremely difficult to extrapolate soil data. So a soil can be contaminated here, but 10 meters later or further, it may not be, or vice versa. So we found a way to try to aggregate those data, but obviously this is far from being really satisfying. And finally, noise data. The data pretty much do not exist at the scale of the island of Montreal. So there are some data for the airport that can be compiled. Students were trying to interpolate noise data based on traffic data, but it was way too much of a stretch, so basically we were not able to use any of those data. So just to synthesize overall these 5 categories, sociodemographic data were overall good, but beside that it was pretty much either fair or poor. So yes, we had a database. Yes, it was an interesting process. But in order to combine those data to provide something that would be meaningful to address the question, is there any environmental injustice in Montreal, it was too much of a stretch. Some students did it, but I think the best result was this one. Combining those different data, well, we can start to see some trends, but as it is conveyed here, it's blurrier than anything, so it gives us some ideas, but we're far from being close to the reality. So that was the first part. Then when we had this database, we start organizing this workshop, asking cartographers and artists mostly, and geographers and people from the humanities. Okay, here's database. We provided the tables, we provided all kinds of maps. Can you develop a project that could help us to understand what's going on in this situation? So we had an international workshop here at about 18 people. We selected 15 projects that were submitted. And the idea was to bring artists and cartographers and people of the humanity to work together. Well, in the reality, it was already a bit of, it was a bit complex for the participants to take a database that is not their own and to develop their own project in a place that is not necessarily their own. So basically, the interdisciplinary dimension was kind of lost in the process. So we saw two trends. First, the artists, we were interested in exploring environmental issue from the ground. So basically, they took the database and say, well, here it seems like there is an issue, and then I'm going to develop my own project in this part of the city. And then the cartographic perspective saying, well, I'm going to take those data, I'm going to do something else, and I'm going to keep looking about the problem from above. So we really had this dichotomy between artists and cartography from above and from the ground. Or I would say this complementarity, because I think this is an important way of addressing environmental issue. So I'm going to show you two examples. One is from Glenn Brown. So he's a PhD student. He will defend his PhD in 2 weeks, so he's almost done. And he's interested in mapping sound, the relationship between sounds and maps. So he does a lot of audiovisual mapping. And just to give you a bit of context about his project based on the database, here's a description that he gives. This chapter describes an initial investigation into possibilities for using audiovisual cartography to convey the potential for emissions reported at least released from point location to disperse throughout Montreal. Motivation is developing this map application was an interest in trying to understand the Montreal BTEX. So BTEX is a combination of 4 chemicals that together are pretty harmful to the health. And in particular, to communicate those data along with contextual information that would help in comprehending them in a manner that would be applicable to a broad audience. So basically, combining this data and mapping them with an audiovisual map. So here's what it looks like when you go to the website. So I'm going to try to do it anyway and see if it works. I have a video if it doesn't work. Okay, so it doesn't seem to be working. And obviously, hopefully this is working. So basically, when you go on the website, you have a legend here that differentiate each of the 4 parts of the BTEX, benzene, toluene, etc. And then each is associated to a specific sound. And then based on what you are, what it did is took all the emission points, all the industries, develop in interpolated maps. So basically, you know that if you're closer to many industries that release those components, you'll be higher exposed to health issue, and you're further away, you'll be lower. But instead of visualizing that, you use an audio map to compile those results. And here is. So this is the legend. We're checking here the toluene. That's the sound for toluene. That's the sound for. And then if you go on the map, the sounds are combined, and you see the source that are affecting the place where you are. You can click and have the information. And obviously you can zoom and see that this is a industrial part of the city, and you can have access to all those information. So that was one way of addressing this issue. Another way from an artist, and that's my last example, I'm almost done, is to take, again, this database, but instead of remapping them, to use it to select an area to do some kind of a project. And here's the post-natural field kit project presented by Sarah Canoes. And basically, it's a field kit that's supposed to bring people to explore a post-natural urban landscape. The project includes artifacts for exploring environmental issues in the city, for specimen jars to do it yourself, air quality monitors, and lead contamination tests. So she's going a bit against the technological development. I can develop a kit that anybody can use, and that is easily usable in order for people to assess the environment, their own environment. And then she took us to a tour of the Turcotte Interchange, which is in the process of being redone. This is a major project here with all kinds of highways that are going all over the place. And basically here is the toolkit that she designed with all kinds of little things. And then there are some cards where she asks questions for people when they go in their environment. They can recall or they can collect some elements to associate with environmental issues. So here, for instance, there's a place where you can collect some dirt in order to measure or assess what is the impact of the highway on this building, for instance. So she took us to a tour, and that was pretty interesting to see how those different ways can help us to navigate the environment in a way that we were not used to. And I'm going to conclude on this rather long quote, but I think we can focus here on this last part. Where she talks about drawing. Drawing classes are first and foremost lessons in looking, in seeing beyond the expected, conventional, stylized idea of an object so as to view it unique, content, and form. If interdisciplinary art projects like a post-natural field kit use language for more than imagery to direct and for the observer, it is because what we hope to see is not visible to the eye alone. So basically, I think this is where both discipline, cartography, and art are coming together. We need different pairs of eyes. We need different ways of seeing. We need different perspective in order to really grasp issue related to the environment. And I'm going to stop here because it's already after 11. Thank you very much.